Yeah, dude, that was such good content. I was like, I'm just gonna start recording. That actually is gonna set the direction for actually where I want to go. And I think this is
Oh,
gonna be
perfect.
perfect for you, Dutch.
Well,
That's
I think here's the meta level thing, right? I mean, to be fair to everybody, right? And to be accurate, kind of with the community and where we are, because I don't like I'm part of the community. The challenge is this, right? CIOs officially started in 1981. A white paper was published, and a book came out within 60 days of each other, basically around the same concepts of CIO. And the white paper has a super nerdy title, as we do, but essentially the topic was, should a CIO be a people leader or a really powerful database administrator? That was 1981. Steve Katz is generally acknowledged, right, to be the first CISO, certainly in the U.S. anyway. So that's 1994 or 5, depends. I think it actually kick-started into 95 when it actually took a place. So that's the official first person by name, right, with the CISO title. So that's 14 years later. So some of this is a timeline issue, right?
yeah.
Anytime there's a new role, a new area, just like there'll be insert, slick AI term for chief AI person, whatever that becomes as we move forward, there's always this nascent period where everybody's trying to decide, well, what is the thing, right? And so if you're over the age of 40 and you're in an enterprise in a CISO role, you probably came up hands on keyboard of necessity. That's super grounding, and it really helps you when you're talking to your team, because you can be like, oh, I remember when I was doing the IR, or whatever your area that you lean into. And that's really cool because you really do get some street cred, and you can empathize with what it's like. But the role and the expectations and the environment has changed so much, right? That I'll borrow from Gary Hayslip for a second. You need to be business leader first, right? You're business leader first who has domain expertise in security, right? And that simple reversal kind of changes the framing a little bit differently so when I'm sort of trying to help coach, people who are moving into those roles, that's what I suggest to them is like, yes, you have to understand cybersecurity. That's kind of a false argument. I hate that dichotomy argument, like they're a business CISO. No, obviously you have to understand cybersecurity. That's silly, okay? But the level of detail that you need is commensurate with the size or the maturity of your organization and what that entails, right? So if you pick a different role that's well understood, CFO, right? They're not running the ledger and accounting. They have a team that does that, right? I mean, I have two cousins who happen to both be CFOs, right? And so their level of course, they have a grounding and understanding of finance and accounting, but that doesn't mean they're doing the detailed work. And so that's kind of the shift that you have to go through, to me anyway, as a kind of a modern enterprise CISO is, can you explain to me what your business does, how you compete in the marketplace, and just basic things? Are you going through a CapEx heavy period? Are you OpEx intensive? Are you going through M&A? Because there's implications for each of those, right? How you look at security, and it has to be in service, right, to the customers, your customers, and to the business. And if we stick at a level which I would think of as tactical, MITRE ATT&CK framework, I love MITRE Atlas, I love OS, I love all those things. We probably all do, right? Because it's the stuff that we grew up with and we're comfortable with. But that's not the discussion with other executives, right? That discussion with other executives has to be, Samir, you're the CMO or the CRO. Hey, where are we headed with these 3 initiatives, and what can I do to align and support those? I inform you about risk, right? Because that's one of my areas of expertise. But I don't say no to things. If you're telling me it's a top 3 critical initiative for you, and here are the things that we need to consider to be able to do that. We might need more FTEs, or we might need some other tools, or we might need to, whatever that downstreaming. But that's not the start of the conversation. It shouldn't be, hey, I need to go buy a tool. The tool is not the thing, And we've got, I didn't even look this year at RSA, what, over 4,000 vendors or something, I'm sure, by now. Are we materially, overall, at an aggregate level, are we materially better at cybersecurity than we were a decade ago? I don't know. I'd love to see some data that proves that. I don't think that it doesn't feel that way.
Are we better? No. Do we spend a lot more money on it? Yes.
Yeah, and I'll even say that's all good and with good intentions. I mean, I'm not suggesting that, but even that you can rationalize, right? If you just pick something to sort of ground yourself in, right? So you could look at, let's just say NIST CSF, because everybody's generally comfortable with that. Simple exercises out of the functions, and we've added govern, right? Super important, right? In 2.0 to it. Which of those are you leaning into this year? And why? So you can make a case if you look at data because MIT has done this, that if we started a company tomorrow, the three of us together, we might lean more into one of those areas in the first 18 months because you have to, right?
Yeah.
But as time goes on, the program matures, we train our folks, they get to be more of an understanding of the environment, then you might shift that investment, right? And I'm just picking CSF. You could pick a different model from DDN or whichever risk framework you like. And I don't see that happening as frequently as I think would be important. And I'll come full circle to identity. And identity is such a critical piece of that. And I think for a variety of reasons that you know even better than I do, it's not had the level of effort that I think it is commensurate as you move to anyone's cloud environment. And certainly as AI becomes more important, you have to nail identity. It's so critical.
Well,
Yeah.
There's a couple of reasons for that. It kind of goes in parallel with where you went, just breaking down where we are as an industry, if you go like from CIO to CISO and things like that. But I'm going to break here and do our intro, introduce everybody. So welcome back to the Identity Jedi Show. This is going to be a crazy post edit. It's probably a little bit different format, but listen, we jumped on it. We just got going. And I was like, this is gold. There was about a whole 5 minutes of gold that Dutch dropped that I didn't get. So it's on the editing room floor. It's going to be in the mixtape. So one of these days we'll go back and redo it. But welcome back to Identity Jedi Show. David Lee here. We got Samir. We got special guest Dutch Schwartz. This is not his first time on one of my podcasts. He has been a longtime podcast subscriber. He's been on a couple of times. The most watched and downloaded episode on the C3 podcast was me and you breaking down. So yeah, congratulations. Welcome back. And of course, co-founder Samir is here as we are hanging out. Samir, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, man. I was just, before we got started, I was mentioning to Dutch that we have overlapped in 3 companies. It's like I'm following him or he's following me or we're just tag teaming. We're not telling each other, but we're just doing it.
It's accidental. And I think Alan Alford and I have done it as well. So like we've, over the years, have been at like multiple places, either right at the same time or right after, or like this overlapping. And then Alan's doing his own thing today too. So it's kind of funny. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Dutch kept me sane during my 10-month stint in AWS prison. So he's one of the many reasons I came out of that thing with my right mind, because him and I just from day one, man, when we met, it was just kind of like, we just hit it off. Yeah. So we've been rocking ever since. So stoked to have you on, man. I want to kick it off and get into this conversation around how we look at, identity and cybersecurity in general. I've talked a lot recently about like this immaturity we have in our ability to communicate what this is like to the business and even senior leaders, right? And you were kind of touching on that, right? It's like you talk to some of these people and it's like, what are you going to offer them? We pick the wrong attributes, we pick the wrong stats. And it's not that it's wrong it's not things that we like that are important because we understand the importance, but we're not transcribing that to say, well, this is why it's important to you. And part of that is, a couple of things. One, you've got 2 people coming from 2 different worlds. When you're talking about if it goes up to the CISO and with the rest of the executive board, you've got people who came from like either marketing or sales or B school with a bunch of people who are hands on keyboards like security people, right? Fundamentally 2 different disciplines of thought and thinking and what they're measuring. And so you bring those people together and it's like, okay, you've got to figure out how to talk. Like what's important to you. And I think we do a disjustice in that we underplay that so much that we're like, oh, we just gave them a CISO title and they're good. And it's like, you expect them instant. They're going to be like one of us. They're going to be a C-level and they know all the things that we're talking about. And I lean on people who sit in that seat. Most of the time you get some CISOs and like you sit in with board members and CEOs and they're throwing CapEx numbers at you. They're looking at forecasts. They're talking about gap accounting. You're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, that's valid. David, I'll give you an example from another domain, and I'll pick on myself, right, because it's always easiest, right? So when I started, Samir and I talked about Arrow Electronics. When I was at Arrow, I'd switched different management roles over the years, but there was a period where I was managing the storage vendors, right? And so today we would kind of call it go-to-marketing. It wasn't called that back then. And I also managed the operations aspect, so the actual admins, right? But I was prepping my president, because remember we used to have division presidents, right? I was prepping my president my first time in the new role. I'd been at the company a long time. So I understood the return on working capital was their critical metric. And I understood that because we were all trained, to your point, David, every leader, no matter if you're in HR or operations or sales or whatever, everybody was trained on that. So that's critical to your point. But secondly, I just finished B school, okay? So I'm like, so I did it and I remember having a conversation with my senior finance person. She's probably a director of finance, I think probably. And I said, hey, yeah, I did a standard deviation, and here's the chart and here's what it looks like. And it was really funny because she had a really great sense of humor. And she said, listen, she goes, we already did all that. Okay. We already did all that. All of us finance and accounting people took care of all the numbers. Don't worry, they're going to be in an appendix. Boom, 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 boom. They need your judgment. Nobody understands this portion of our business better than you do. So thank you for running a standard deviation and whatever charts I try to run and do my, with a newly minted MBA, right? She said, I appreciate the effort. And she was kind of chuckling. She said, but we've already done all that. What we need is your judgment. And so what I want to say is it's both of these things, right? So when I think of reporting to the subcommittee, and often we're reporting to the wrong subcommittee, but when we are talking about other leaders, just period, other leaders outside of our own domain, you have to be able to do both. You want to quantify in the best way you can. You don't want to spend an overabundance of time, which gets you 0.5% different. But you do need to, but that's probably somebody's at the manager director level, right? To do that. Whomever runs your phone program, whoever runs identity, whoever runs GRC, etc., they should be deeply steeped in that. But ultimately, as an exec or senior leader, you need to translate that and say, here's my qualitative judgment, right? It's both of those pieces, right, that go together. So you want data whenever you can have data, but you also want judgment whenever you can apply judgment. And you should always caveat that with, based on X, Y, and Z, this is why I think, And that way, if they don't agree with your premise or they want to, redirect that, then it's not an argument about your position. So as long as you state it clearly. But that's the piece that when I look at board presentations is still nascent. It's still growing, right? Because people don't have the language, right? And so it's to your earlier comment, David, it's about translating. Yeah. So Samir is my boss and he's the CIO or the CEO and I'm the CISO. I have to be able to translate that in the business terminology. Here's what's in our letter to the shareholders. Here's what's in section 1A of risk. Here's what's in the guidance from the board and from the executive team. And you're translating. So you're using that knowledge that you have about your domain, but you have to translate it into what's this mean to the business? And so if you put on the other hat, you can appreciate what sometimes they probably walk away from interaction feeling frustrated, right? Or maybe just that just didn't click, because they're trying to understand, but that would be like me listening to back to my finance person talk about Sarbanes-Oxley for an hour, right? Like I would get the first 3 minutes, and after that, she probably would lose me because that's her expertise area, right? So it's the ability to translate those two. That communication skill, I think, is so important, and it seems even farther away for some reasons in GRC and identity that we haven't lifted those up in a way that I think that we would all probably think is important.
Well, and part of it is I think the second half, these are still very, very young disciplines, right? Identity as an actual, whatever you want to call it, like top line, top of mind priority, less than a decade, right? Yeah. That the business is actually given a shit about identity, that it's actually made the top of the list for like CISOs and board members and stuff like that, right? So we're talking less than 10 years, right? Then you go back and look at cybersecurity in general, we'll give it maybe 30. Maybe 30 years, right? As a discipline, right? We've been doing engineering and mathematics for centuries at this point. Right. There's true best practices, things of that nature. This is still a very young discipline that we're in. What we've tried to do is map all these things in other areas, but it's also different in the fact that it's probably one of the most fast-moving disciplines that we've ever seen, right? Like mathematics doesn't change all that much. Physics doesn't change all that much. Yes, we discover new things, but nowhere near the rate at which we do when the basis of the things that we are using, our base tools, within a decade are drastically, 100x faster, 10x. It's crazy. What I used to do before to calculate this, I can now, and it took me a room of equipment and things to do, I can now carry in my pocket, right? With all that, we're trying to catch up and develop these kind of disciplines. And when you take a broad step back and look at this and go, okay, we can give ourselves a break a little bit, right? It's like we are very much still learning how to do this. But then diving back down into it, it's like one of the things that I look at, and it's been a recurring theme here recently, is we have to start focusing on, we've got to teach our technical folks, right? On the other hand, I don't believe everybody needs to go to business school, all this stuff or whatever. Like, I just don't believe in paying $140,000, $200,000 for an MBA to go learn how to run. Like, if you want to go learn how to run a business, like start a business, right? I'm gonna be nice today, but like maybe we'll see. And I'm not knocking anybody that's going to be school. Like, not it's everybody chooses their own path. I'm always about like, you always can't say it's the only path. That's my thing. If B school was the path for you, that's great, but you can't tell me it's the path for every single person, because understanding, to your point, like Dutch, understanding business and terminology and then how to switch that, like that's something that can be learned and be taught. And so what I think, there's two things that I look at is A, as technical leaders, if you want to jump into that CISO role, wherever you're at, as soon as you move up, you've got to take that onus on you to realize that like, what I know from hands on the keyboard is not enough. I got to start learning actual, how this business operates and what's important to them, what metrics they go by. On the other hand, I would say to these leaderships, like if you're a CEO and I'm going to go have a CISO, like understand that they don't come from your world, right? You and I will put this directly on the CEO because I'm big about this. You as the leader of that organization, it is your job to make sure that, hey, my senior leaders have what they need to be successful to help run and operate this company, right? So the same way you're going to provide resources to your HR part, your head of HR, your head of engineering, you need to do for your head of security, right? Hey, here's what's important to the business. Here's how we do these things, right? I think there needs to be a little bit more effort and support on both sides of that. I think right now we just kind of, the CISO just seems like a revolving chair. We'll get somebody else, put them in there, let's let them figure it out. And it's like, okay, they didn't 18 months ago, let's bring somebody else. Like I don't know. I'd like to see a little bit more, intention there to really kind of truly making that work and deciding, like, as a business, when you operate, yeah, you may be sales or marketing background and all this stuff or whatever. And again, I get it. Security is now this kind of quote unquote relatively newer thing. And you got to start working at it, helping your CISO decide, like, what does that mean to our business? We want to lower down, our expenses. We want to get our EBITDA up, right? And you're using all these little factors. And for like years, you've ignored or put it in the cost of doing business, security, and all these operation things. Now you need to help them figure out, like, okay, when we're doing all this stuff, like how much of what you do, right, impacts this? Hey, let's figure that out together so we can decide like what this looks like. Right. This is different, right? The day you start operating, the day you sign up and get an AWS account and start, developing apps and open up those APIs and putting S3 buckets and deciding this is how you're going to deliver a service to somebody, like you became a security company, whether or not you realize it or not. And so you got to start considering that into your plan. Hey, Jedi, thanks so much for listening. We're going to take a real quick break because we got to give a shout out to our sponsors. Hey, our sponsor for this week is Zilla Security. Are you ready to transform your security? Then you need to get with Zilla Security, because if you're ready to make access easy and efficient, Zilla Security's got you covered. Their platform connects into everything: cloud infrastructure, on-prem, cloud applications, you name it, you got it. Zilla's going to be able to connect you to it. It's a place where your security and IT teams can review, monitor, and assign access across your enterprise. I'm telling you, they got you covered. Just like that sauce back in the day, it's in there. So listen, you want to see it in action, you want to learn more, here's what you need to do. Go over to zillasecurity.com, hit them up, say, hey, I want a demo, and then tell them, hey, the Identity Jedi sent me over here. All right? So listen, that's it. Break over. Let's get you back to the pod.
There's so many threads you can pull. So I'm going to start like the high level, just the tech piece that you mentioned. Let's step back and talk about just digital transformation. If you just digitized what you were doing via analog, then you missed the purpose of the revolution. A lot of places did that, and then you could fast forward to refactoring and things. But if we go back 20 years, if you just digitize what you used to be doing via paper and you didn't say, what can we do differently now that we have all these technology resources? Now, new companies do that sort of out of necessity, right? Because we start a company and now we're here and we're going to start with this in mind, right? And here's all the resources and tools that we have. But larger, older companies always have a debt, right, that they're having to pay off. And if you're going to pay off that debt, you should do it really intentionally. And that means you have to say, well, what can we do? Speed, scale, time to market, time to revenue. Pick some of these key things and say, what can we do differently? And if you don't do that, then cybersecurity was an outcome or an outgrowth of IT. And so if you sit in that realm and you have these sort of two layers that are stacked, not against you, but that are not really helpful. One is, well, did you just digitize what you were doing before? You just took the old process and you put it online. That's That's like step one. But step three is, okay, now what can we do to make it more efficient, to scale, to speed, give a better user experience, right? To that person that feels personalized to them, right? And if you stay in that mindset of, well, we're just a cost center, that's not helpful, right? Everybody, unless you're the actual sales and marketing team, is a cost center. But you don't see that because that phrase, the way it was used historically anyway, is a bit of woe is me. Guess who else is a cost center? Research and development, engineering, legal, finance, HR, and keep going. Everybody who's not directly involved in impacting the revenue is a cost center. And a cost center is just a notional concept. You can read the three major financial statements that all of the world uses, and cost center is not a standard definition in any of those. Cost center is a way for the three of us to decide how we put costs related to running the business, right? But it's not actually in your financial. You can be if you choose to be, but there's no place it has to be in there because it's an internal construct. In other words, we could run a company, same size, same industry, and our three friends could run a company, and they could do their cost center structure totally different than ours. That's a finance and accounting discussion, right, of how you want to manage your business internally. But saying, oh, we're a cost center, it doesn't further the conversation, right? It keeps you here, and it doesn't allow you to do anything. So there's sort of two things that you talked about in terms of the what I would call the leadership challenge, right? And you're right, because if you're expecting a CISO has all the leadership training in addition to their domain expertise, then your expectations are probably skewed, inadvertently, right? And so, what do you owe somebody as a leader, right? Direction, purpose, mentoring, and motivation. Where are we headed? Why are we going there, right? I need to mentor you, right? And motivation is not like intrinsic motivation, but what can I do to make sure that, Samir, you're motivated? I know both of you guys, you're motivated differently than I am, than David is, right? And so it's trying to tap into each person's motivation, make sure I knock down obstacles and do the things that I can if I have a different title than you. But that's leadership, right? And so the piece that CISOs or senior leaders can control is how are you coaching and mentoring your own people? And that's another gap that I think that we do have control over is what are we doing for the next generation, people who are managers or team leaders today, so that they are, one, are you talking to your peers if you're at a company, right? They should be already talking to legal, sales, HR, finance, etc., right? Early in their career to set those relationships, because then they'll just be better off over time if they have those relationships, right? You shouldn't become a CISO and be like, wow, if your only friends, your work friends are also in tech, you've missed a huge opportunity, right? To socially learn, to your point, David, right? Because you can learn through that. You can learn by, hey, let's grab a cup of coffee, let's go have lunch, let's have a beer. I don't really understand, I'll pick on Sarbanes-Oxley again because everybody understands it. I don't really understand SOX, or I understand it at a high level, but what does that actually mean to our business and what do we need to do differently? And translate that into, hey, this is why we need, I'm telling you, like, this is what we'll need to do, right? To make sure that we meet our obligations to both customers and fiduciary responsibilities. But I mean, Samir, you've obviously done this a bunch of times. What do you think about sort of the way that CISOs as leaders are how it's structured today?
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say, this is probably going to be the most watched episode for me. I'm going to watch this again and again. Just the way you both are kind of bringing this stuff together is awesome, first of all. And so I'm just going to do a shout out, like any CISO, aspiring CISO should listen to a lot of this amazing insight from both of you. So first of all, thank you for that. Secondly, funny thing is every time I start to talk, my screen freezes up. But then I realized it's just me thinking that I'm important. So let's move on. So I think, so there's a few things there's a lot of things that you guys talked about. So I'll start with things that are top of mind to me, right? One is you both have worked at global companies, right? I truly believe it's a combination of culture, as in the countries that we work in, along with the culture of the company. That's a microcosm of it. And the third is me as a person and the culture that I bring to the table. I bring a certain mindset. Maybe it's not a culture, maybe it's more of a working style, working expectations, etc. So when we talk about this whole like cost center and the fact that CISOs are chasing their tail a lot of the times, David brought that up a few times. I think a lot of it is based on the fact that we are a true definition of a capitalistic economy, right? And it's not so much about cost center, it's about who is actually bringing in the revenue. Who's the guy with the backpack that's going around or briefcase and closing the deals, right? in companies like Amazon, and Dutch, you were there, David, you were there, there's a lot of respect given to engineers because they build what is being sold. And a lot of the selling happens organically because people know Amazon, because they use it, they can play with the product online, etc. Right? So we have a lot of emphasis on security, infrastructure, operations, engineering. They're very well paid at companies like Amazon, right? Now you flip that switch to Arrow Electronics, which is a different animal, right? Would you give as much respect to the engineering team, the IT, they call it IT, it's not really IT, but now I think Amazon, Arrow actually has a CTO, which is pretty awesome. Back then it was, kind of a hybrid role. So I think culturally in Europe, from what I've seen, they've been talking about security and compliance because let's not get into the fact that, half of Europe was communist, half of Europe was socialist. Half of Europe might still be socialist in many ways, depending on, Bernie Sanders.
That's a good conflation, by the way. That's hilarious.
Two of my favorite people, Bernie's, right? But the point being is that in a socialist type environment, you're not rushing to throw things out the front door and say, buy, buy, buy. I'm going to sell you a half-baked product that you can build on it or whatever, right? Look at SAP, look at German engineering, look at Japanese engineering. That mindset is build it with quality. And for me, quality and security kind of go hand in hand. So they might be slower to market, but they've been thinking about security. It's been built into their mindset of building securely, building to some extent with quality, right? So we in America, just the CISOs in America, I feel, and just having talked to CISOs globally, have a harder time because they're juggling with this mindset of, you're a cost center, get out of my way, I got to get this out the door. Including engineering managers will turn to security and say, you're asking for too many things, I've got a deadline, I've promised. I don't have a choice, right? So one is that cultural mindset of how do we take the best of what we see in global economies, quality products that are being built, quality organizations, quality-minded organizations that we can take into the US is one example. The second is, I think Dutch, you really hit really hard on this, where I grew up in compliance and risk. And when I came to engineering companies, they'd look at me and say, so you mean you're not an engineer, so you can't be that smart. You're just kind of giving us this policy governance bullshit, right? And then you go to governance companies that are very well governed, financial companies, name the big banks, right? And they will look at engineers and say, you are too tactical. You don't speak my language. You're low level. Dutch, you use the example of going to a board presentation with the right amount of information and stuff, right? It's a typical conundrum of like, I know too much about what my problem statement, and therefore I can't get my head out of it because I know I can solve this and I can do it well and I'm good at what I do. But then we look down upon them and say, you're too tactical. So let me get managers over them to speak my language, right? Or let me have them speak to one of the board members who's a former CIO so they can look good. And we will not actually elevate them from a leadership standpoint. I think the one company that I can say that I've been at that doesn't do that is Amazon. Amazon's very good at kind of saying, okay, how do we make you a subject matter expert, stay the subject matter expert, but then grow you? And the one thing, again, good about Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc., they don't have title inflation, which I love, which is a lot like Europe. I said, what do you get promoted to? He's like senior assistant executive president, or vice president. So I said, senior executive assistant vice president means nothing. What do you do? Right? He works at a bank, so you can understand that. I'm like, we got to stop trying to make people happy by giving them this, oh, here, David, here's 10K more. Or here, David, let me give you that ELF 4.5 level, because Amazon was very defined. I think it's our way of trying to keep people happy and keep them around and motivated without actually saying, listen, man, you can get paid a shitload of money by being a principal engineer at Amazon. I can tell you, there are principals, senior principals at Amazon who are very good at what they do. We pay them well. But when you go to a non-engineering company, and you know this, Dutch, you know what I'm talking about. If you're really good at one thing, they're like, you're just good at something, you will get paid 100K for the rest of your life. And we don't respect it. Do you really want to be a CISO? Why do you want to be a CISO? You really just love application security. Why don't you just become a really good, service provider in that space and go work for an AppSec company? It's okay not to have the C title. But again, to David's point, we'll give the C title, but not a seat at the table. So it's okay, man. Just call me head of, security, right? And just give me a double title, right? I'll do my security and I'll do it well and I'll keep you safe, right?
I want to see the business card.
I know.
Yeah, no, I mean, you made tons of great points. And I've been at 5 startups as well. You guys have been back, big companies and small companies. And you make some really great points, Samir, about culture. Not just, again, we often think about organizational culture, like the way that and organizational psychologists to talk about it, and we do talk about that. But you're right; it's in the context, right? Always, right, of the culture of the larger culture that you live in. And if you've ever seen like Hofstede's work when he was at IBM at the time, but it's still out there. You can go and say, I'm from country A, and my person I'm working with is from country B, and you can see on the power dynamics and the different things, right? But the culture is so critical, and again, in service to what, right? In service to your customers, and then includes your internal customers, right? And so you have to nail that culture. And when you talk about quality, it really hits home with me sooner, because I use it sometimes when especially if I have like a lot of engineers and architects in the group, and I talk about quality. So if you look at the history of quality, the way we think about it today, right? Dr. Deming and his mentee, Dr. Duran, get a lot of credit, but actually Dr. Schwartz started it in World War I, okay, and in the 1920s, and Deming then made it more popular, right? And then Duran kind of was the one who could articulate it, right, in a way that kind of a regular person could read their books. But the point there is that if you look at quality in 1910, quality would have been the quality of David's workmanship as an artisan versus Samir's, right? You both make shoes, right? You're cobblers, right? And because you didn't have systems of systems in 1910. Okay, in the 1920s through the 50s, all of a sudden it accelerates, right? When you start having systems of systems, you had to have a construct of, quality needs to be part of the process, right? And if you look at the history of it, you go through iterations where, first of all, it's just the awareness. And that's kind of where we are with cybersecurity and identity in GRC today, right? Awareness, I don't want to make it sound like I don't think it's critical, but it is the first step.
Yep.
I can be aware of lots of things, though, and not do anything. What you're trying to do is impact and action. I'm trying to change, right? Anybody listening to the podcast, if you want to look at a model of culture in a security environment, Dr. Carrie Perlson from MIT wrote a great white paper. It's co-authored with Kaman Wong about culture, and she's spoken a number of times. But there's one picture that I sometimes draw, and that's what are the levers, right? Because sometimes people who are technically oriented, that helps them. And it's values, attitudes, and beliefs. That's what goes into your culture, right? Values are the things that I think are important. Beliefs are the things that I think to be true, okay? And then the rest of it is how I show up, right? The way I prefer to take kind of your early points from here, how I like to act in a work environment with other professionals. That's if you don't nail that, if you don't talk about, well, what do we collectively think is important? What do we value? And if you don't have that alignment, that's where you end up at a company and both parties feel slightly off. And it's just because you didn't really nail the values. And it's not like a right or wrong thing, right? It's a continuum, right? And maybe one company or culture values independence, right, more than organizational efficiency. That's totally fine. But you need to articulate that, right? What do we value? And then what do we think is true about the universe that we live in, right? Together as a team. And so you need to nail culture, and it really deserves more attention. And that brings me to my last point, which is we need more ideas from other domains kind of come full circle, right? So because we're still a young discipline, mostly people in this discipline were all trained the same way, right? So you have a mental model. I sometimes talk about Bruce Schneier's using people, process, and technology. Not his idea, by the way. He popularized it in IT. That idea came from Professor Levitt. It used to be called Levitt's Diamond because there was actually 4, and they collapsed it into 3. If you look at Schneier's own blog that he wrote about it years later, he was doing that because people only talked about the tech. Talking about people and process was kind of mind-bending in 1999 when he popularized this. But we've come a long way, gang. Like, it's 25 years later, and you need a different mental model, I would suggest, to help us as a community move forward, right? So I think of leadership, culture, and strategy, right, as those other 3 pieces, right, that you need to layer on top of those. Because if you just focus on people, process, and technology, when they say people, what they really mean is sort of downward, right, like to your team. That's usually not how people say that in our universe, right? And it should be. Interesting. Right? Yeah. So it's leadership, culture, and strategy, because strategy then lifts us all up, right? Not tactical. It has to happen. You have to nail that. You got to be great at it, right? In any group of people, you have to have expertise, but then you go up, right? And now I'm at an operations level. Can I train Samir, and can Samir train me? Can we document it? Do we have a process? That's that operational. But you have to get to strategy, which is put on our big thinking caps and where are we headed? What do we do, the 3 of us together, if we were starting a company tomorrow? What do we value? And what do we think about the world, and how are we going to bring something different to the world that will delight customers? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what you're doing, right? If customers, and we kind of shy away from that in technical domains, but that's what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to give a killer customer experience to people. Because if you do that, then they'll come, right? But you have to have the right culture, and it's not just cybersecurity for the sake of cybersecurity.
Yeah,
Cybersecurity is in service
yeah.
to your customers.
I remember the word neurodiverse coming up quite often with
Yeah.
CISOs were talking about getting different mindsets, and they're just not just hiring a bunch of engineers and putting them in a room, right? So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, and one, just diversity, right? I mean, we could go on for that for a whole other hour, right? If everybody looks like me, we have a problem. We need to try harder, because that should not be the case, right? And again, from all of the aspects, right? So neurodiversity, cultural diversity, background diversity. David, to your point, I don't have a hard set opinion either. Education, it's great if you have it. That's awesome, right? But again, to me, that's level. That's a level. You spent some time learning a thing. That's awesome. That might be super valuable. Now, what do you do with that?
Yeah,
Both of those have to be there, right? You have to, and that's where leadership and mentorship really helps somebody. It's awesome. You know, like if I talk about skills versus competencies, right? Like I could study a thing and then take a test and pass the test. And that's a real thing. Can I actually take that and apply that to a novel situation in a different segment, in a different business, at a different company? That's a different discussion. And that's where coaching and mentoring is so valuable, right? Because you have to have a language that we all talk, right? So when I say NIST CSF, you guys are both nodding because we know. If I say MITRE ATT&CK, if I say OS top 10 LLM, or if I say any kind of concert, we have to have that to start a conversation, but then we have to go somewhere. Right? Okay, cool. Now what are we going to do with this, right? I'm glad that we all agree on kind of the terms and what the baseline is, but what are we going to do that's different? I'll give you an example from our past life, Samir, I think. But before you were there, I was having a discussion with the company, and they said, hey, we're going to buy a DLP. That's what they said in the meeting, right? And I'm in an advisory kind of role, so I'm just sort of sitting, you know. And so the account team, great, very qualified engineers, architects, etc. They would have leapt over the table, you know, if I'd let them, because like, oh my gosh, we have DLP, we have DLP, you know. And I was like, oh, okay, hold on. And I say it was a director, I believe, of security. And I said, hey, why do you need a DLP? It's not a snarky question. Like, I'm being serious. Like, what is it you hope to get out of a DLP? And he sort of paused, and he goes, oh, well, I mean, I guess it's compliance. I'm like, oh, cool. Let's talk about that. Okay. That's a real thing. You have to do it. Not that's stipulated. But we're sitting in your headquarters, and I see a sprinkler over my head. The way that you're talking about compliance is that sprinkler. It's required of you. You have to do it. It's a safety feature. I understand. But tell me how that sprinkler system helps your customers or helps your team compete vis-a-vis whatever your marketplace is. And he said, oh, well, I never really thought about it that way. I said, right, so if you're going to invest in a DLP, and again, you can swizzle out, say XDR, I don't care what it is. If you always talk about it like an object, you're not abstracting it high enough to say, well, what do we hope to get out of this? So it was Force Point Raytheon at the time, right? And what are you going to get out of that? If you're going to spend the money, you're going to invest the time and the resources, etc., please tell me it's not just compliance. Because 10 years ago, only 9% of enterprises in the world actually had DLP and blocking mode. 9%. Why? Because it was too hard, right? There's all these one-offs where every executive had a different, and every culture, and every... Right, so it's not a ding on DLP as a technology. It's a ding on the process wasn't working in a way that unlocked the value, right? So if you just talk about, you know, this object, then it's just a piece of tech. It doesn't get to the heart of the matter, which is what can we do better, faster, an improved customer experience, scale more innovation, more flexibility. What can we do differently if we invest in this technology? And that's the piece that gets missed. You know what I mean?
That's fair.
Yeah. Defined outcomes, right? You know, bringing it back to identity, right? One of the things that we struggle with identity is that we don't talk about the actual defined outcome. What are we coming into? Again, we're good about problem solving. Like, oh, you've got this problem. Password reset. We'll fix that for you. What does that do for you? Right? To your point, like, okay, you're going to fix we'll do your password. We automated all your password resets. Great. Now what?
I think
we don't talk about defined outcome. You want to go from here to here. Why? To do this. Great. Here's how we're going to help you get there. Here's what these things are going to do. Here's you're going to start to see the progress that you can track towards that outcome you're going to get to. And then in X amount of whatever it is, days, months, years, you'll be at this defined outcome. Why do you want the defined outcome? Oh, it allows me to do this with the business, right? It's some of these things sometimes it's like, I think sometimes we're too smart for our own good. And it's why I always use analogies.
Yeah,
like you wouldn't
point.
do that, right?
Yeah.
You know, when you think about security stuff, like all this stuff, I was like, okay, like, would you do that at your house? Would you give your 5-year-old your AR-15 and just let them walk around with safety off? You know what I mean? There's just
Well, you went
certain
all
things
Texas
you
on us,
wouldn't do.
David.
Yeah, I know, right?
Okay, listen. All right, we're not going to talk about Texas.
I just thought it was funny. No,
I
you
think it's a
nailed it
combination,
though, right?
guys. So it's a combination.
Yeah.
It's brought up shared understanding, right?
Yeah.
We talked about this on a previous podcast, David, where somebody said, "Oh, I want to do password resets," but their understanding of what password resets or self-service around it was very different than what the customer wanted first, which is a big problem. The second is that everybody in the room that has part of the ownership or stakeholders in this didn't understand it, right? The second is, the vendors, and I'm a vendor now, so I can say this, right? We are part of the problem in confusing the situation by trying so hard to get any business that we can because we want to show revenue, we want to show growth, we want to show all these things. No, I can do that. Yeah, just give me 3 weeks and I'll build it for you. But 3 weeks to build something to the expectations, well-defined, long-term strategy fit for the customer. So I'm not propagating that we should all, I think analogies are great, David. I think summaries are good. I'm not going to propagate 6 pages for everybody out there, but I think it's helpful. It's helpful to have a strategy. It's helpful to get feedback from neurodiverse people. I'll use neurodiverse or diverse people as a whole. I think it's not an attack. We should all take it as feedback is a gift, right? In whatever form you get it. Without that, we will be chasing our own dreams, and the dream will never become reality.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's probably a great note to wrap on, gang. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, and we probably will
Yeah.
another time, but I appreciate it. I think these interactions like this help people see from different perspectives. We have to continue to move the community forward, right? And so we could probably come back and pull out some of those themes, right? But we talked about leadership, we talked about quality, we talked about telling stories. David, you're bang on. That's how humans learn, right? Telling stories.
Yeah.
We have to up level collectively, so that we're really focused on, when we say the business, I mean, again, I want to rotate so far to your point earlier, Samir, that we're talking about just the capitalistic outcome.
Yep.
Because that's not most people's why. Once you get basic needs met, and we can put a pin in that, that's a whole different discussion. But once we get above that, right, that's not people's why. Like, that's not why we get up every day and do this thing. I mean, we could do something else that would be probably not as mind-bending some days, right? But what's your why? And so if the why is we want to move everybody forward, and we also have to do it in a way that brings them with us. And here's how you don't bring people with you: when you just tell them to go do a thing. That doesn't work with humans. I don't know. I have 6 kids. That does not work. Okay? It doesn't, right? I mean, so you have to set boundaries, right? But you have to teach them, well, think about a 4-year-old, right? There's why, right? And it can be exhausting as a parent, but to your point, Samir, when you look back on it, you're like, man, that's such a great exercise, right? Why are we doing this? So if you just tell the, quote, average employee, hey, you need to do a thing, they'll do it. But they don't understand. I mean, and that's not on them, that's on us. We have to help them understand, hey, why is this important? Or you have to have a culture that allows them to ask the question, right, in a safe way. And then you have to be willing to explain that. Hey, this is why we need to do this way. And I know you probably didn't think about this when you went to school for accounting, but cybersecurity is what protects the digital value of our company. And I don't care if we're making bicycles or airplanes or software, there's digital value because that's just how value exists in most companies today. But that's a shift. That's not probably the way they learned in school if they learned 20 or 30 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so it's all companies, I would suggest, or almost all companies today, unless you're maybe in a non-governmental organization or charity or something like that. But I mean, in the average typical enterprise company, certainly in North America, is a digital company. And you need to think hard about, well, what does that mean? Because it's not just the physical things, but it's everything else. And to do those correctly, guess what? You have to have governance. You have to have policies that make sense to the person who's executing the policy, not just the wonk who wrote the policy. And you have to really nail identity, and then you have to have a way to check that, right? You have to be able to follow through with audit and compliance things that keeps you, in the guardrails.
This was just as great as always.
Good to see you
Thanks
guys.
for taking the time.
Yeah.
We're planning. There's a road show coming with the podcast.
Cool,
We
man.
definitely have to make sure that Denver's on top of the list, man.
Yeah, or I'll come down.
Too many good
You got
people there.
A big event or whatever. Yeah. Hey, man, I was being sincere. I got tons of friends that live in Texas. I'll come down to wherever you guys want to. I'll come down.
We could probably do Red Rocks. That would be interesting. I don't think we're that big yet.
That would be sweet.
But that would be dope, though, right?
Yeah, you could just go on a regular day when there's no events or whatever. Dude, there's people playing hacky sack and doing drum circles. Why can't we do a podcast?
We'll make it happen.
All right, guys.
everybody, listen, thanks for tuning in. If it's on Spotify, it's on Google Podcasts, and we appreciate it if you're watching on YouTube. Make sure to like, rate, subscribe. It all goes a long way. We appreciate you. Check out the Identity Jedi newsletter, theidentityjedi.com, and shout out to the Identity Jedi University, which is coming very, very soon. Be good to each other, be kind to each other, love each other. We will see you guys on the next episode.
See ya.